Good evening, and welcome to our penultimate session of the World Cup Comes to Seattle speaker series being organized by the Global Sport Lab. We're really glad that you're here. My name is Ron Krabill. I'm the director of the Global Sport Lab, and we're pleased this evening to be focusing on Egypt, the only team that is scheduled for not one, but two group stage matches here in Seattle this month. Before we get started, two quick programming notes. First, a reminder that next Monday will be our final session focused on Seattle's Pride Plus match and LGBTQIA plus rights during and beyond the World Cup. Our guest will be Jen Barnes, co-chair of the local organizing committee's Pride Plus Match Impact Council and the founder and CEO of Rough and Tumble Pub. And we will welcome back Mary Harvey, winner of the 1991 World Cup and now CEO of the Center for Sport and Human Rights, as well as the author of the United Bids Human Rights section. Second, just a quick reminder that we're once again operating as a hybrid program with about 80 students in the room and several hundred participants registered online. Following an initial presentation from our guest, there will be opportunities for Q&A, both in the room and online using the platform Slido. And we will put up a screen with Slido instructions for those of you online when the time comes. Thanks once again to our co-sponsors, the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at UW-Bothell, which is my academic home, along with the Responsible Business Law Initiative of the Behr Institute at UW School of Law and the Jackson School of International Studies. Now, I am really pleased to introduce tonight's special guest, Dr. Abdullah Al-Arian, who is an associate professor of history and chair of international history at Georgetown University in Qatar, where he specializes in the modern Middle East and the study of Islamic social movements. He is also the editor of the Critical Currents in Islam page for the e-zine Jadaliyya, which is a go-to resource for many of us. He is the author of Answering the Call, Popular Islamic Activism in Sadat's Egypt. And most importantly for our purposes, he is also the editor of Football in the Middle East, State, Society, and the Beautiful Game. And I just want to take a moment here to say that this book, here's the book right here, is a really wonderful resource. I've learned so much through it, and I highly, highly recommend it to everyone watching. So Abdullah, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. The floor, or I guess more accurately, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Ron. I really appreciate it. My thanks to you and to everyone at the Global Sports Lab and at the University of Washington for this really kind invitation. It's so nice to be with you all today. Obviously, it's a very exciting time. We're sort of counting down. I think we're now in like single-digit days almost for the launch of the World Cup. And so it happens that Egypt is going to be playing, as you mentioned, not one, but two of its group stage matches in Seattle. I do hope that some of our audience here will be able to attend at least one of those matches. You'll be in for a really lively atmosphere. There's a very large Egyptian diaspora across the United States. Even just last summer when Al-Ahli, which is the most popular club in Egyptian football, competed in the Club World Cup, their fans were seen across mostly the East Coast in cities like Miami and New York, and really brought so much excitement and energy to those matches. And so I expect to see just the same at Egypt's matches in Seattle. So what I hope to do with my time here is to tell you a little bit about Egyptian soccer, its intersections with Egyptian national history, culture, politics, economics, and so that hopefully by the end you'll have a pretty good understanding of how the sport has come to play such a critical role in so many aspects of modern Egyptian life, and give you the kind of context and background that might be helpful as we kind of see Egypt's role coming to bear in this upcoming tournament. I should mention at the outset, and thank you, Ron, so much for mentioning the book, but I want to talk even just a little bit quickly about the idea of studying the question of soccer in the Middle East more generally. And it's something that's really emerged in the last decade or so, even though it has such a long and rich history in the region. But I think more of a global interest in the sport and its connections to the Middle East based on a number of different developments, things that I'm sure many of our audience are familiar with, whether we're talking about, the Gulf countries' ownership of some of the biggest European clubs like Manchester City. We just saw yesterday, um, or I should say, day before yesterday, Paris Saint-Germain, which is owned by the state of Qatar, has just won its second Champions League title in Europe in a row. And so there's clearly a lot of connection that I think, people are beginning to draw. And for that reason, scholarly interest has grown quite a bit. And this also has to do with the fact that the last World Cup host was Qatar. It was given the the bid that it won back in 2010. So there was a kind of a 12-year lead up to Qatar hosting. And during that time, there was so much both controversy, but also excitement and scrutiny and controversy and curiosity, and people really trying to kind of learn a little bit more about, what is it about this region that is now emerging as such a major global player in the sport of soccer. And so I've been fortunate to be involved in a couple of those projects, as Ron mentioned, the edited volume Football in the Middle East, which actually has a couple of chapters that are devoted largely to the question of Egypt and Egyptian soccer more generally. There's a really wonderful historical chapter on the origins of the Egyptian League by Ibrahim al-Hudaybi. And later this year, I've co-edited along with, sorry, excuse me, along with a colleague of mine, Thomas Ross Griffin, a special issue of the journal called the International Journal of the History of Sports. It's dedicated to sports in the Arab world. So please look out for that also coming out later this year. And so what I hope to do in the time that I have is to give us a sense of both the history, but also kind of more recent manifestation of Egyptian soccer. And so this is kind of some of the main things I'd like to cover, is kind of going back historically, understanding the origins of Egyptian soccer, how it's come to occupy such a massive place in Egyptian social, cultural, political life, seeing the various developments that have happened throughout Egyptian society, whether we're talking about its experience under colonialism or attempting to gain Egyptian independence, and the role that football has played politically, both way back in the 1919 revolution, but also in the 2011 revolution against authoritarian rule that we saw with the Arab Spring uprisings. But also thinking about kind of the way that it even helped shape modern Egyptian identity, the way that it's intersected across things like religion and class and other kinds of divisions within society to try to help form a more cohesive modern Egyptian national identity. The way that it's also given Egypt such a presence within the African continent, in particular, when we think about CAF and the Egyptian domination of the football tournament that's been held in Africa every couple of years since the 1950s. And so there'll be a few different things that I'll try to focus on. It's a lot, I know, to cover. I'll do my best to keep it to time. But I do want to say, if there are questions, please feel free to interject at any point. Ron, if there are hands, if there's anyone that wants to kind of stop and ask a question along the way, definitely feel free. But otherwise, there will hopefully be also time for discussion afterwards.
Perfect, no problem.
So just kind of going back to the roots, and again, I don't know how much this has come up maybe in some of the others. I'm a historian by training. I should start by saying that maybe. So for me, it's always fascinating to look back at the kind of some of the origins of these questions. And so when I think about football, as much as it's easy to kind of think about the World Cup and where things stand today, but it's really fascinating to see the way that this game that we maybe take for granted as a global phenomenon today, but thinking about it in terms of how it became a global phenomenon. And a lot of that actually goes back to this question of colonial rule, that at a time when particularly British and French Empire had conquered much of the world, really, we're talking about the global South in terms of Asia, Africa, Latin America, for much of the 19th century, we do see that the kinds of cultural exchanges that take place during this period of time is the way in which soccer becomes transferred largely from the global north, largely from Europe into other parts of the world. And so in a case like Egypt, for instance, we see that the Egyptian national identity formation was in part facilitated by the idea that football becomes a space on which identity becomes kind of displayed. And a lot of that has to do with the way that even just soccer expands from initially a British colonial presence that dates all the way back to 1882. So when the British occupation of Egypt had kind of taken root, initially you see a determination to simply provide leisure activity for soldiers who were stationed there, but over time that gets transferred onto what's known as a kind of Effendiya class, meaning that certain elite colonized citizens and subjects become transformed into what was known at the time. They refer to it as properly obedient individuals, that they saw that sport was actually a way to kind of civilize and to try to transform members within society that were expected to be slowly integrated into a kind of ruling class that worked alongside colonial officials. And so they looked at things like physical conditioning as forming a very important part of colonial education. And so the game itself actually evolves quite a bit. And you can kind of see maybe from some of these photos, including the bottom photo of the British soldiers playing football with young Egyptians, that the game initially had what Ibrahim al-Hudaybi calls a kind of creolized manifestation, where it was played kind of without real structure, without real rules. It was just kind of just fun for particularly young kids to kind of go out and just explore and experiment with the game in a way that lacked the kind of structure that we are accustomed to seeing. And it was only through the introduction of some of that structure that it was meant to produce the kind of ideal colonized subject that one sees. And so over time, many local elites internalize some of these discourses on organized sports as a mark of cultural and civilizational advancement. And so this emerged in a number of different ways. Partly was the competition to produce their own sporting clubs. And so Al-Ahli, which is just kind of the national sporting club that was founded officially in 1907, again, still during the era of British colonial rule, was established in part because all of the sporting clubs up to that point were European founded, right? So they were largely British, perhaps French or Italian, but mostly they were founded by Europeans and were very exclusive in not allowing for membership coming from even the country's indigenous population. So Egyptians were not allowed to join these exclusive European clubs. And so Egyptians then decided to begin founding their own clubs as a way of kind of both competing, but also demonstrating a certain kind of sense of belonging, a sense of maintaining their own national identity and ability to kind of, compete on the same level with European clubs. And so Al-Ahli was the very first of those Egyptian clubs, and it happened to emerge right at the same time as we begin to see expressions of Egyptian nationalism. And so in 1919, just after World War I, Egypt experiences its first really modern revolution as a country seeking its independence. And so this featured mobilization largely in urban centers. It cut across class, it cut across religious affiliations. And in part, football becomes seen as a place where political organization is happening, in part because the British colonial rulers forbid the establishment of political parties, didn't allow much space for politics to take place in the kinds of traditional venues that we would expect. And so actually many of the leading political figures were members of sports clubs or were on the boards or founders of some of these sporting clubs and used the sporting clubs as a way to be able to express themselves politically in a way that actually will be very familiar to us when we fast forward all the way to the 2011 revolution, that in cases or in situations where there's a kind of a crackdown or a kind of authoritarian environment, whether we're talking about British colonial rule or we're talking about later on, an Egyptian dictatorship, there will always be other avenues by which people will be able to express themselves politically. And in that sense, sporting clubs actually become some of the leading ways of doing so. And so after Egypt officially gains its independence in 1922, there is actually an interesting sense that the way to kind of prove your belonging on the global stage is, to a certain extent, your membership, not just in the kind of traditional political institutions, right? So today, for instance, we think of a country becoming independent by gaining recognition in the UN, right? You become a UN recognized member as a state. Back then it was the League of Nations, and so Egypt did put in for recognition from the League of Nations, but it also put in recognition with the Olympic Committee and later on with FIFA as well. In fact, I think there's a photo here in which an Egyptian national team competed at the 1920 Summer Olympics. So this was actually 2 years before Egypt officially becomes independent. And then the bottom photo shows the first Egyptian team, in fact, the first African team to compete in the FIFA World Cup. And that was all the way back in 1934. And so being recognized globally meant something, particularly in these kinds of sporting environments. Now, domestically, when Egypt becomes independent, it is a monarchy that has an ostensibly kind of liberal parliamentary structure, but really it was a constitutional monarchy. And immediately the king, he was initially a kind of an Ottoman governor who then gets elevated to the status of king. And he begins to see in football a way to get as much kind of political currency as possible. And so you start seeing all of these new competitions that are named after royal figures, whether it's King Farouk or the Sultan Hussein Cup. And so Al-Ahli in this photo in 1925 is being pictured with having won both of those competitions. And so yet again, there's this sort of intersection between attempting to kind of make inroads within society, particularly as football, on the one hand, is representing a kind of space where political elites, but also social and economic elites, people with a lot of power and wealth, are able to display that in a way that is visible for the entire society. But at the same time, it's important to also note that the sport at this stage is becoming an avenue for upward mobility for people, right? So you're talking about kind of gifted young athletes who are discovered and all of a sudden are able to make a name for themselves, that are able to make a career, that are getting, famous and also gaining a certain amount of wealth. You have a couple of stories of Egyptian players who actually end up going off to play in England. And so there's also a sense that it's an intersection between both the kind of traditional elites who are actually ruling the country, who are the owners of many of these clubs, who are attempting to kind of put their imprint on the competitions, but also a way for people from lower middle classes within society who are able to come, step into a position of having far more influence and far more success socially and economically. And it's at this time, kind of in this sort of interwar period, that you begin to see the birth of the biggest club rivalry in Egypt. You may have heard of these clubs, Al-Ahli, which was voted, I think, the most significant kind of African club in the 20th century due to all of the championships that they won, both domestically and across Africa as well. But this is the period in which its major rival, Zamalek, is also born. Now, Zamalek is the team that kind of, these are two clubs that represent very kind of different historical trajectories. Zamalek initially started off as kind of what was called the mixed club, that was far, let's say, friendlier with the European elites. Over time, it allowed for Egyptian membership before, the revolution comes along, and then it kind of transforms itself into becoming yet another more indigenized Egyptian club. But it does have that kind of more colonial root to it, which is why, one of the reasons at least, that we hear in terms of why that rivalry emerges. There's also kind of a number of other factors. There's the class elements, there's the geographic element within Cairo, the city. There's even a kind of a major, a kind of a mythological story about a famous player named Hussein Higazi, who, plays on the streets of Cairo, ends up going to study at Cambridge. One of the first Egyptians to play in the English League, where he played with Fulham before he returns back to Egypt, tries to found his own club, which was kind of a popular thing for players to, for successful players to do at the time. But then he goes on to play for both Al-Ahli and the Zamalek. And so both of those teams have sort of claimed him as part of their legacy. He starts off at Al-Ahli, he plays for Zamalek, and retires there. And so this in part is part of the sort of the big story behind their historic rivalry. And yet again, as we mentioned, King Farouk is here utilizing the power of soccer to showcase his own popularity. So this is also right around the time that the Egyptian league itself is taking shape. Now, again, the politics of how a league forms is quite interesting, in part because it reflects many of the same types of politics that we're all used to seeing, but more in the kind of more traditional, let's say, economic and political spheres. But with sports, it tends to see the intersection of both of those things. So in 1948-49 is the very first season. There's the kind of professionalization of the sport. There are rules, there are contracts that are laid down, limits on, which players can play for which teams. The power is then transferred to these league bodies, and powerful clubs basically get to write the rules. And so, clubs like Al-Ahli and Zamalek are the ones that are kind of beginning to dictate the terms. You see a kind of loss of the power of individual athletes and players to be able to have their impact. And then, of course, you have the political factor where the king himself is attempting to also wield a certain degree of control. So there's all the kind of intersection of these things that are happening, particularly in the 1940s. I also wanted to mention this. This was another interesting photo that shows the kind of diplomatic effort that soccer displayed during this period. This is a photo of Al-Ahli doing a tour of Palestine in the mid 1940s. And it's insignificant for a couple of reasons. One is I think, it showcases the way that even at this point in time, going and playing friendly matches and expressing solidarity at this point with, Palestinians at a time when we were already beginning to see the kinds of roots of both the kind of the settler colonial project, but also the continuation of British rule. Remember, Egypt had just fought off British colonialism a couple of decades earlier. And secondly, because this is something that continues well into the present day. So even into the 21st century, we see that Egyptian football fans, as well as the clubs themselves, have quite a strong political voice, both on the question of Palestine, but on a number of other issues as well that they've mobilized around in recent years. And you can see that kind of across their social media. You can see it across, some of their archives as well. Things really begin to shift in the 1950s. So beginning in 1952, due to tremendous political upheaval, the monarchy is no longer popular. All of those sort of elitist politicians are seen as having failed to kind of deliver the country all of the kinds of development and modernization ambitions, and especially the independence and autonomy that was promised after the revolution against the British, are overthrown one day in July of 1952 by a corps of officers known as the Free Officers, led by a man named Gamal Abdel Nasser. It's a name, if you've studied any Egyptian or even just Middle East history in general, modern Middle East history, you've probably come across Gamal Abdel Nasser. He's the one sort of sitting right there in the middle. And he becomes not just the first Egyptian kind of real head of state after a very brief transition period led by Mohammed Naguib, but kind of the real president who begins to shape a very different kind of Egypt, an Egypt that is more of a kind of revolutionary military state, one that becomes increasingly authoritarian, that is also promising tremendous amounts of modernization and development, but also is very much part of a broader third worldist non-aligned movement. Nasser is a cornerstone of many of these kinds of anti-imperial, anti-colonial forces that coalesce largely in the 1950s and 60s, and kind of brings Egypt far more forcefully onto the global stage. And he's doing this in part through his ability also to wield the sport of soccer. And so this happens in a number of ways. He's made the honorary president of some, important clubs. He's overseeing the kind of continued evolution of the Egyptian League. He oversees the construction, again, in addition to all of the major national infrastructure projects, things like building the Aswan High Dam or nationalizing the Suez Canal or all sorts of other kind of major infrastructure projects. He also oversees the construction of Cairo International Stadium, which opens for the first time in 1960. And here you see a kind of much more recent image. It's been expanded over the years, but certainly it's considered one of the most impressive stadiums in the entire African continent and the entire Arab region, and one which continues to play host to all of the most important matches that the Egyptian national team plays. Nasser also oversaw the establishment of the African Confederation. So it becomes officially recognized as the representative of the African continent's different football federations within FIFA. And so all World Cup qualification then goes through CAF. The very first tournament, so just a couple of weeks after the launch of this organization, the very first African Cup of Nations is held in 1957. It's interesting for a couple of reasons that CAF is founded initially by or by four countries, rather, I should say, but one of those is apartheid South Africa. And so as soon as the South African government announces that it will only be fielding an all-white team, the other members immediately place a ban on the South African Federation from competing in any African Cup tournaments. And that ban actually remains in place until the fall of apartheid. And so it's only that it enters the competition for the first time in 1996. It's actually a tournament that it won. It's the only win that South Africa has had. But it shows to a certain extent, again, Gamal Abdel Nasser being kind of one of the visionaries of the establishment of CAF and helping lead the launch of the African Cup of Nations. And so Egypt wins the very first two. It goes on to win a couple of more. But then it's really in the early 2000s that it goes on this three-peat that's never been done, where it wins in 06, 08, and then again in 2010. And so now it's considered the team that's won the most African Cups. And so it's kind of dominated African football for large periods, although now it's been something like 16 years since its last victory, something that I know Mohamed Salah has definitely seen as kind of having failed to live up to the standards of previous Egyptian teams, despite the fact that he's, highly likely to be the best Egyptian player of all time. But that certainly is seen as kind of a place where he's fallen short, is being able to have won during his national playing career. And so there's the photo of the third of the three titles that was won by the Egyptian national team. Again, it came during a period in which there were a lot of legendary moments, different players who've written their names in the history books, whether we're talking about their, I think, 40-year-old goalkeeper Al-Hadari, or we're talking about Mohamed Abu Trika, who later gets himself into political trouble in the aftermath of the Egyptian revolution and coup 2011 to 2013. But a number of other players who kind of were sort of the core members of this team. And it was seen as a time of kind of re-inspiring Egyptian soccer for a whole new generation of fans, seeing this kind of level of success, given especially the fact that Egypt had failed to make it to any World Cup since 1990 until 2018. So there was a kind of a very long gap as well in terms of not having made it into any World Cups. And so dominance on the African continent kind of was seen in a way as having at least sort of covered the inability to make it or qualify for a World Cup. And this is sort of where things also get a little bit interesting, is kind of seeing some of the sort of the other side of that success, right? So in the midst of that three-peat of African Cup titles, there was a last-ditch attempt by Egypt to qualify for the 2010 World Cup that ended in tremendous controversy and even tragedy. That was being heavily weaponized and instrumentalized by the Egyptian government. This is now, we're talking the regime of Hosni Mubarak, who's one of the later successors of Gamal Abdel Nasser. He had been ruling at this point for something close to like 30 years, was not particularly popular. And there was always he was well into his 80s at that point, Mubarak was. And there was a big question about his succession plan. He clearly wanted his son to emerge as the next president of Egypt at a time when there was not a lot of popularity for him. He wasn't really a known figure, despite the fact that his father came out of the military, which was what had granted him legitimacy. Gamal Mubarak was not someone who enjoyed that much popularity. And so enter the 2009 World Cup qualifiers, which came down to a last-ditch playoff between Algeria and Egypt, in which only one of the two countries would be going on to the World Cup. And so in this two-match playoff, there was a tremendous anxiety, you can say, across Egyptian society that was heavily this was sort of before really social media had taken off, but there was a lot of traditional media, radio, newspapers, a lot of TV talk shows that were kind of building up this like massive animosity toward Algeria, both the nation, the people, the team itself. And this ended up unleashing a certain amount of violence by the fans against the Algerian fans. And so you see that even the team bus was attacked by Algerian fans. Some of the players were injured in the process. It got so bad that the second leg of that playoff had to actually be played at a neutral location. And so the African Federation decided to host the game in Sudan just to avoid that violence. And yet you still saw actually attacks in Cairo once Egypt lost that match against Algerian businesses and anyone perceived to be Algerian. Now, a lot of this at the time seemed like it was just, people in the headlines would just chalk it up to like unruly fans and fan violence. But it emerged more and more that the regime was actually very heavily stoking this animosity. And it was none other than Gamal Mubarak himself who would be kind of going on the radio, saying these kinds of incredibly aggressive, hostile things to try to legitimize himself. And so in a way, it was almost like, given that he lacked a military career, but it was like he was leading the Egyptian team into battle. And that was supposed to kind of make up for his, lack of any kind of meaningful political or military experience. And so he was sort of, instrumentalizing soccer as a way to establish a kind of base of followers within Egyptian societies and support that didn't really go anywhere, particularly given the fact that they ultimately lost. And so this emerges as kind of a very shameful chapter in the history of Egyptian soccer. And only 2 years later, in some ways, not surprisingly, perhaps. I mean, if you're talking about a regime that's been in power for 30 years, that's not particularly popular, and is desperately trying to cling to using people's passion for soccer as a way to stay in power, then it's probably not surprising to see the emergence of a mass uprising in which millions of Egyptians mobilized in 2011. I'm assuming many of the students probably don't remember this if they were quite young at the time, but it was quite a momentous occasion that was covered across the global press, that was kind of being lived and witnessed in real time. It was unfolding largely. At this point, it was really unfolding on social media as well, that oversaw the overthrow of the regime, the Mubarak regime itself. So Hosni Mubarak was forced to step down. His sons were also arrested and put in prison. And there was a lot of talk even at the time about the fact that, these so-called ultras, right, these fan groups of particular football clubs actually played a really critical role in mobilizing the protests, in part because one, that soccer fan clubs had experience in terms of going into stadiums, going into these sort of packed spaces, going into confrontations with police on many occasions. And so they actually brought a lot of their experiences from football into the protest movement, and helped actually hold the line when security forces would come in and try to break up the protests. And so there was a real recognition that it was actually football ultras, among many other different groups, obviously, but they clearly had played a role in a way that, again, as we saw even going back to the 1920s, when all other kind of political spaces are foreclosed due to kind of really repressive environment, that people find other ways to express themselves politically. And so being able to gather and come together collectively in a way that allows them to express themselves really just through the power of a sport, when political parties, for instance, independent political parties, were not allowed. This really came to play such an incredible role during the height of the revolution. Now, a couple of things then happened. One, of course, that many people probably are aware of, is the fact that the revolution ends up being toppled by a military coup in 2013. So it lasts just over 2 years. And in the lead up to that, there were already a number of violent incidents. And one of the most kind of really dreadful and dark moments in the history of the Egyptian Revolution of 2011 was actually a massacre that occurs in the stadium in Port Said of traveling Al Ahly fans. So 74 fans were killed in all. And it's now very heavily believed that this was an orchestrated assault, that the police, angry about the role of this particular fan group, wanted to get its revenge. And so they had kind of orchestrated a situation in which they allowed, armed thugs basically that were supported by the police into the stadium to attack unarmed fans. That led to kind of really the worst violence we've ever seen in the history of Egyptian soccer. It's become such a focal point of the modern identity of Al Ahly. There have been attempts to seek justice for the victims, for their families, through the courts. Many of those have not gone anywhere, particularly now that Egypt is living under another authoritarian government. That, in fact, many of the members of the fan club themselves have been arrested, have been continued to be harassed by law enforcement. Some of them have gone to prison. But more importantly, as we see kind of going forward, is that the actually fundamental transformation of Egyptian soccer fandom as a result of the military coup. So ever since 2013, fans were banned from stadiums. And so long before COVID, long before, the image of football being played to empty stadiums becomes kind of normalized, right, in 2020, 2021. This was already happening in Egypt back in 2013, in part due to this kind of overall categorical ban on fans. A few years later, that was partially lifted, and so you started to see individual fans coming in, but fan clubs like these ultras continue to this day to be banned by the Egyptian state. I think now, given a kind of a post-coup era, there's a recognition that that these clubs are spaces for political indoctrination, for mobilization, for coming together collectively, and so the severity of the crackdown is far beyond anything that we've seen historically, and continues, well over a decade now since those events. So as we kind of look into maybe some other more contemporary questions, I mean, I think, one of the other recent developments that are worth mentioning in the sort of post-coup era. So we're talking about kind of the Egypt of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who you see there in the top left corner shaking hands with Mohamed Salah. Is that, in the last decade, you can see some other developments, one of which is the rise of Salah, who's arguably the greatest African player of all time. He's reached unprecedented heights in European soccer, becoming a Liverpool legend. He's set to leave. Actually, he just played his last match a couple of weeks ago at Liverpool. But there's also been a kind of renewed political interest in soccer by the ruling regime. So here we see Sisi not only meeting with Salah, but when we go back to the 2018 World Cup, so this was Egypt's first qualification in 28 years. If you remember, that World Cup was held in Russia, and it ended in total disaster. Egypt ended up actually losing all three of its group stage matches, despite the fact that going in, they had a decent squad. I think there was expectations that they would win at least one, maybe draw another game, maybe have some outside shot of qualifying for the knockouts, but having lost all three, including a match to Saudi Arabia, in which they were really more heavily favored, opened a lot of questions about, why did it perform so badly? And a lot of the attention actually turned to the fact that the team was being so instrumentalized by the Sisi government. And so you had, stories that like Mohamed Salah was being called to come to all sorts of VIP meetings with various supporters of the regime at all hours of the night. The Egyptian camp was stationed in a region of Russia in Chechnya, where there was a kind of a local kind of notorious warlord who also insisted on kind of spending time driving Mohamed Salah around and giving him, a Chechen passport and all sorts of things, so that there actually wasn't much focus on the soccer itself, that a lot of it was the politicking had taken over to such an extent that even Salah himself, actually, after that World Cup, quit in anger, threatened to retire from the Egyptian national team. At one point, he also begins to sue for his image rights. And so you can see there that top right photo of him, blazoned across this Egyptian national airline, that, he said his image was being exploited. This was at the same time that we also begin to see kind of the mass commodification of soccer. And again, a lot of what we see in Egypt is very much part and parcel of what we see globally, which is the idea that it's becoming increasingly corporatized, increasingly subject to so much massive global investment. Here you see Salah on one ad is advertising for both Vodafone and Pepsi. And again, some of the things we started off talking about, the increased interest in outside investment. Egypt is no stranger to that. We have a couple of very significant cases. One is a very recently developed team. I think it was established in like 2008 called Pyramids FC, that was subsidized by a famous Saudi investor named Saud al-Sheikh. There was also another historic club actually from the 1930s called Ghazal al-Mahalla that was experimenting with an IPO to try to raise additional funding, and an IPO that actually ended up failing. There's renewed investment in things like the Egyptian Football Association headquarters, so they have brand new facilities, and so there's a kind of competition and challenge to compete with the way that football is growing globally, in part largely due to all these kinds of infusions of corporate sponsorship, private equity investments, et cetera, and a lot more foreign sponsorship than what Egypt is used to seeing. And so that's really helped transform the game in many ways, both obviously ways that people have been critical of, but also ways that have undeniably grown the game a lot within Egypt. And there, just on the bottom right, is also the proliferation of more and more competitions. And so there's something now called the FIFA Arab Cup that's being played, every year or every couple of years. Qatar actually just hosted the most recent one, and so there's Egypt kind of competing in yet another competition in addition to the African Cup in this FIFA Arab Cup. And so all of this brings us to the present moment, to 2026, where Egypt has qualified for the World Cup only for the fourth time in its history, which means there will obviously be a lot of pressure to see it perform. I will say, I think, when you look at its group, it's in a group where I think it'll be seen as having a very legitimate chance of progressing. It's also likely the very last time we'll see Salah on the biggest stage. So he'll be coming with something to prove, particularly given, as I said, that he hasn't won any major titles with the Egyptian national team, but also coming after a very disappointing final season with Liverpool. And so you can rest assured that no matter where they are in the world, Egyptians will be following it, no matter how inconvenient some of these kickoff times are. You have some that are at 4 a.m., others at 6 a.m. But Cairo is, if anyone has ever been to Egypt, is a city that never sleeps, and so that won't be a problem. There's also a very sizable Egyptian and even just a broader Arab diaspora in the U.S. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think we saw that, especially last summer when Al-Ahli was competing at the Club World Cup. And here we have even, I think there was a message from Seattle's mayor who was apparently welcoming Egyptians to the city, seeing as that they'll be playing 2 of their 3 matches there. And so, yeah, so I hope we managed to cover quite a bit in a short amount of time, but I do hope that you found that beneficial. And thank you all so much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. Really informative, thoughtful, and insightful. We really appreciate your time. So I'll open it up to questions. We'll alternate between the online Slido and in the room. I'll actually take one from Slido, which I also have, so I'm using a little bit of a moderator's prerogative here. But here in Seattle, we've been hearing a lot about the Pride match, which is Egypt and Iran. And I'm curious to hear from you if you have a sense that, of course, we know that the Egyptian FA and the Iranian FA have both lodged complaints with FIFA over the Pride match, and we'll be having a session next Monday specifically about the Pride match. To what degree is that even on the radar screen of common fans in Egypt, or is it even known about? If it is known about, do people care about it deeply, or sort of what's been the reaction within Egypt specifically?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I know it's definitely been talked about probably a lot more, I would say, in the kind of the social media sphere than perhaps, just kind of in ordinary circles like in cafes and things like that. I don't think it's made as big of an impact as a subject of conversation. I think people are just looking forward to the actual matches themselves, and less so around. And I mean, this is always the case. It's always less about the politics around it for a lot of people than it is just about enjoying the competition. But I think, this is in some ways indicative of the kind of seeming contradictions between, national teams going out onto a global stage where on the one hand, they're looking to kind of leave their imprint to sort of bring their national identity, their colors, so to speak, onto a global competition, but at the same time understanding that this is a global competition, right? It's one that is intended to embody universal values and is intended to be far more inclusive and a place for also, hearing and listening and learning from the experiences of others, right? Like this is exactly what we want to see when we see things like the Olympics and World Cups and other kinds of major international tournaments and sporting events, is the idea that it should be a space that is ultimately shared. And at the same time, you get perspectives about, respecting national cultures and values and all sorts. So this is sort of very much at the intersection of those things. I am glad that there's a session on this next week. I'll definitely be tuning in. I'm really curious to kind of, listen and learn kind of on how it's being, received and perceived locally, especially within Seattle, but even kind of, domestically here. But I would say it's, I think initially the responses were far more top down. As you said, it was not just it was the FA, but also really from the state media, that was taking a kind of very firm stance. And again, a lot of times this happens in large measure as a way to kind of, the state cynically perhaps asserting a certain, declaration of values, on a national level as a way of kind of closing ranks and maintaining boosting its own position and its own popularity at a time when I would reckon that actually within Egyptian society things are far more mixed, where you definitely have various points of view and opinions, and things have certainly shifted. I know this was also a question in the lead up to the Qatar World Cup, where there was a lot of misrepresentation, for instance, of what was going to be allowed to unfold there and things like that. So unfortunately, in a lot of these instances, a lot of things are sort of lost in the kinds of communication that goes in part because so much of it is reflecting particular interests, and so you don't actually hear enough, I think, from individual experiences or from people who are there sort of on the ground, as opposed to kind of what the official position is from the state or from its media, et cetera.
Great, thank you. I'll take a question from the room and I'll repeat it so that everyone online can hear it. Questions? Don't be shy, you know it was coming. Okay, I'll take one more from Slido then. Um, how could Egyptian soccer be a beacon of hope today, seeing that the gains of the 2011 revolution have since eroded?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think, it certainly has been a very difficult decade in part because I think that the coup experience has really foreclosed so many of the spaces that historically had existed as sites of where people can kind of, come together collectively to mobilize, to find their political voice, find some political agency. And so I think the extreme paranoia, let's say, on the part of a far deeper authoritarian regime that we're seeing means that even those kinds of spaces, things that are otherwise just sort of cultural spaces, are very difficult to find avenues to mobilize. Um, And especially when you add to that not only the kind of securitization that happens, right, where the regime is sort of viewing any attempt to do anything through security, but even if we actually take into account the commodification, right, so the economic element of it, where it also becomes completely just a site for for corporate growth. I think FIFA is the biggest culprit of that. I think we've seen it in the commodification of this tournament time and time again. Each year it gets every 4 years it seems to get just a little bit worse in that regard. So you add both of those things, and it's a very toxic mixture, so to speak. But I will say the sort of the one silver lining is that there's only so much that all of these forces can control. I mean, I think this is really the beauty of the game, is that there is something that is unequivocally egalitarian about it, that once you get people in stadiums, once you get people gathering in spaces to watch matches, once you get the actual 22 players out on the fields, there's only so much that a regime can do to control what happens next, right? The idea of hope, the idea of possibility, the idea of unintended consequences and unintended fallout coming from matches. I mean, again, I think we saw a lot of this in Qatar 4 years ago, where everyone had an idea of what they expected to see happen in that tournament, and yet all of a sudden it kind of took on a life of its own. And we saw things like global solidarity with Palestine at the time. We saw so many other different kinds of expressions of people sort of coming together in really strong ways that I think precluded all of the attempts to kind of sanitize it that FIFA would like to see, where it becomes a totally apolitical space and it becomes completely just a place for Coca-Cola and other sponsors to go and kind of reap their fortunes. There is something that ultimately about this particular game and these competitions that doesn't fully allow for the levels of control. And I think in that there's always some degree of hope.
Fantastic. Thanks. Another chance for folks in the room. Yes, please.
You could talk a little bit more about the stadium ban in Egypt, and I think kind of similar to the previous response, but maybe just a little more context to that, and then sort of how has that changed what it means to sort of be a soccer fan, or how has it changed with the perception of soccer in Egypt?
Great. So the question is, if you could talk a little bit more about the stadium ban and how that has really changed what it means to be a soccer fan in Egypt and in the stadiums. Is that a fair representation?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think it really has fundamentally altered so much of what we've come to know about Egyptian soccer culture in the way that it had evolved, particularly, I would say, since the 90s on, because I think that that's really when it began to take on a very specific kind of identity, in terms of, so many of the songs, the chants, many of the ultras groups, like all of those things really came to life in that era of sort of like 90s, early 2000s, up to about, 2011, 2012 was really kind of the peak, actually. And so what we've seen is kind of an attempt to sort of hollow out Egyptian soccer culture in an incredibly aggressive way, to where now it becomes seen again as this like very sanitized, commodified thing where it's people are expected to go in as individuals, right? You don't go in as part of a collective. You don't go in as part of a fan group. There are laws in Egypt now banning 10 or more people from getting together for any occasion, right? There are laws against public gatherings that remain in effect, more than 10 years, or now we're talking 15 years, since the revolution. So in a sense, there's a kind of, steep climb to kind of get back to what we used to see. There's also the kind of the massively apolitical tone in which, yes, fandom is expressed, but it's expressed purely based on what's happening on the field and nothing else, right? Like you can't comment on anything that's happening anywhere else. We've seen a small amount of mobilizing, again, around Gaza, I would say in particular, that has sort of found some voice in the last 3 years in particular. But beyond that, in terms of it being a space where people are talking about, kind of many of the major issues that they're facing, particularly the economic hardships that Egypt has, that large segments of Egyptian society have faced in the last decade, there's very little avenue to speak to that within this. And of course, all of this impacts soccer fan culture, because it's meant to be organic, it's meant to be spontaneous, it's meant to be an outgrowth of people's perspectives and experiences in a way that has now, it's almost like there's a far more top-down attempt to control it and contain it, and to introduce what are the acceptable chants, what are the acceptable songs to sing, and to a certain extent, I think it's not sustainable, and so it's going to be a process, but over time, I do expect to see kind of a slow rebuilding of what was there before.
Fantastic. Another question from Slido. Could you say more about Egypt's sense of itself as an African team in the World Cup as opposed to an Arab world or Middle Eastern team?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think it exists at a lot of these different intersections, and I don't think that they're all necessarily mutually exclusive. I think, there is a sense that the African competition, it has been superior to the Asian Cup, for instance, and so that Egypt is playing, and this explains at least one of the reasons why, for instance, Saudi Arabia can have such an easier path to making it to multiple World Cups, but Egypt hasn't, right? That they've found it very difficult, in part because Africa has been incredibly competitive as a place where so many of these national teams, when you're talking about Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, which of course was the host in 2010. That there's so much competition there, in part because African football has experienced such massive exponential growth over the last kind of 25 years or so, in a way that comparatively, at least, we haven't seen the exact same kind of emergence of, for instance, when you think about what Morocco achieved at the last World Cup. And that people might look back now and say that was really a dark horse performance, and it was unexpected. But in a lot of ways, I think given the talent that they have and have had, in the way that Morocco has developed its national team, it actually wasn't that surprising, right? That in a sense that they've been kind of on the cusp of this exact type of performance, and I think Egypt sees itself very much in the same light, that it should be seen as potentially having the ability to be a footballing powerhouse, despite the fact obviously it doesn't have the same advantages as European teams, but certainly as a result, I think Egypt definitely sees itself as being very much part of the broader African continent. I think that's where its its most important and significant achievements have been. In terms of the way that the identity plays out, I mean, it's kind of interesting because it does serve as kind of at the intersection. I mean, the Egyptian team is known as the Pharaohs, so it very much feeds into its pharaonic past and its idea of a kind of the ancient great civilization, etc., as opposed to a kind of more recent or modern kind of Arab identity. So in that sense, I think it does on occasion play into some of those tropes a little bit, but yeah, it's definitely a balancing act, I think, especially now that you do have this Arab Cup. But again, I think it's very interesting that Egypt will send its first team to play in the African Cup, but it'll send a kind of B team squad to play in the Arab Cup. So that also kind of gives you a sense of its priorities.
Right. The hierarchy of tournaments is alive and well, for sure.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question from the room. Yes, please.
Resistance to there's been lots of popular resistance, but are there any examples of that coming from players resisting the federation?
Great. So the question is, are there any examples of players resisting the government or the federation, like through, as opposed to, like, it's one thing to talk about popular resistance, but have players taken any kinds of stances?
No, it's a really excellent question. I mean, I would say two things come to mind, both of which I mentioned really in passing, but it's worth kind of going into a little bit more detail. The first is Mohamed Salah. What I mentioned is that I think there was a point where he really became very resistant to the idea of having his image being used by the Sisi regime. This was particularly around 2018, but it actually lingered on for a couple of years after that. I think it was at a time when the regime was very desperately trying to legitimize itself and using him. Now, again, he would never go so far as to actually condemn the government or to speak out against it. He was simply doing so in a way that was very kind of personal to him, which is, his image being impacted in that way. But he beyond kind of briefly threatening to walk away from international duty, he never really went beyond that in terms of making any kind of political statement. I think, people at this point, I think, are aware that Salah is notoriously apolitical in many ways. And is far more concerned with his image insofar as its ability to kind of yet again also be kind of commodified in certain ways. But then you also have the case of someone like Mohamed Aboutrika. He's someone who is seen as kind of a linchpin of that squad that won the 3 African Cups from 2006 to 2010, was very much on the front lines of the protest in 2011, was vocal in support of the candidates coming out of the revolution, but in particular the Freedom and Justice Party, which of course was the political wing of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And for all of that, as soon as the coup came to power, they actually put him on watch lists. They seized some of his wealth. He ended up becoming a sports commentator for beIN Sports, which meant that he was living in Qatar at the time. So I don't know even that he's been back to Egypt since then. I think at some point, I remember reading that he was taken off of the sort of travel ban and that he was no longer kind of wanted by Egyptian authorities. But I still don't know if he would think it's safe necessarily to go back. But that's certainly one example. And I think that there was a very clear attempt to make an example of him because he was such a high profile person, someone who's, an Egyptian footballing legend. To be subject to that kind of treatment meant if it can happen to him, it can literally happen to anyone. It didn't matter how famous you were, how beloved you were, what you had achieved. And so I think that definitely had a chilling effect, for sure, among other possible, athletes that would want to speak out, in this past decade or so.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. We appreciate so much your time. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to prepare for as Egypt arrives. Looking forward to seeing the matches with them here in Seattle. So thank you so much again, and have a great rest of your evening. Really appreciate it. A round of applause, please, for Abdullah.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much. And do enjoy for those of you who are going.
Great. Thank you. Just a quick reminder, especially for our online audience, that we will have one more session next Monday night, 5 o'clock, focused on the Pride Match and LGBTQIA+ rights at the Cup and beyond. Otherwise, have a good evening, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Take care, everyone. Bye.